Well, good afternoon once again. We are at that time of the spring festival season. Tonight we're going to be taking part in an occasion that we call the night to be much observed. Let me ask you a question. Why is this particular night to be much observed? Why is this particular night to be observed or remembered in some notable way? You know, over the years there's been a lot of confusion that many people have had, even some in the church, regarding the night to be much observed and the Passover. The Jewish community is going to be observing a festive meal this evening. Some ways there will be similarities to what we're doing, and yet the occasion that they're going to observe this evening, they're going to call the Passover. Now, we observed the Passover last night. As I say, there are even those in the church who have been confused about the connection between the Passover and the night to be much observed. Some think that somehow the Old Testament Passover was at a different time than the New Testament Passover. And then, again, you get back to this occasion that we call a night to be much observed. Why do we do what we do, and why do we do it at all? Well, I want to address some of these questions today because I think they're things that we need to understand, that God would want us to have a clear view of, and to see the connection. Because, you know, as far as the festival, when the last holy day of unleavened bread comes along, we don't have any special festivity on the evening that begins it. When Pentecost starts, there's no special activity that is set aside for that. When the Feast of Trumpets comes along in the fall, there's not some special activity or some special note that is given to the evening before. Why do we give special note to the evening that begins the Feast of Unleavened Bread, particularly the evening part that begins the first holy day of the days of unleavened bread? Well, if you want to understand something, you need to go to the beginning. Now, I'm not going to go all the way back to Genesis 1:1, but let's go to Exodus 12, because here we have the story of the introduction of the festivals. The festivals illustrate God's plan of redemption for His people. It outlines the plan and the way in which God is working to redeem His people. And it was these holy days, these festivals were given here with the congregation of Israel. In Exodus chapter 12 and verse 1, the Eternal spoke unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Now, the Hebrew word used here for month is Chodesh, and it literally means moon. I think clear that it was a new moon, and God told Moses that this particular new moon is to, from now on, be the head of the year, the beginning of the year. That was different than what had been the case, because from the time of creation down to this point, the year had normally begun in the fall, because that's when it started, way back creation week. You know, if you think about it a little bit, it's the only logical way. We've been enjoying the spring. You see all the trees, you know, the fruit trees, and you see them all blossom out, and some of them just loaded down with blossoms, really beautiful. But if you were Adam in the garden, while you could admire the beauty, you wouldn't have anything to eat, would you? Because you'd have to wait until the fruit had come along and been prepared. God obviously started a mature creation, and it was harvest time. It was ready for Adam to reach up and pluck stuff off and start eating. But the holy days, God wanted to illustrate a certain plan and pattern. And so there was a particular order, and the harvest seasons that God had designed were now to be used as a type of the spiritual harvest. So Moses was told how they were to count months. God gave him the instructions, and he told Moses to speak to all the congregation of Israel and say, in the 10th day of this month they shall take to them every man a lamb, according to the house of their fathers, a lamb for a house. And the lamb, we're told in verse 5, was to be without blemish, a male of the first year, either from the sheep or from the goats. It was to be kept up until the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening. That's the way it reads in the King James and many English translations. The Jewish translation reads, they shall kill it at twilight. Now, I want to point something out to you, and it's not obvious from the English translations, but there is a particular Hebrew word, erev. We would spell it out, E-R-E-V, that's close enough. Erev, which means evening. Now, I can show you from the Scriptures what the biblical definition of evening is. A lot of people who've gotten tangled up on this, they look here and the Talmud says this, and Rabbi so-and-so said such and such. You don't have to go to all these sources. The Bible defines its own terms. Now, the term evening is used dozens of times, scores of times. I was looking, filled up 2 or 3 pages. I didn't try to count all of the entries, but suffice it to say scores of times, used many times in the Old Testament. But there is another phrase, and that is the phrase that is used right here in verse 6. It is a phrase that is used in only 5 passages, 5 chapters in the Old Testament. Used maybe about 7 times, but it's used in 5 specific accounts, 5 chapters. The Hebrew term is ben ha-erevim. It is involving the plural form of erev. It means, if you wanted to translate it literally, it would mean son of the evenings, or it's normally translated between the 2 evenings. It's an idiomatic expression, and I can again show you from the Bible, from the way the Bible defines its own terms, exactly what that means. Because those who who sort of confuse the Passover and the night to be much observed, who keep it, they want to claim, well, this is talking about sometime in the afternoon. Well, let's notice here, first let's define our terms. Let's understand, what does the Bible mean when it says erev? It's always translated evening in the Scriptures. Back in Leviticus 22 and verse 6, it's talking about unclean things. And let's start in verse 5. Leviticus 22, verse 5. Whosoever touches any creeping thing, whereby he may be made unclean. I'll tell you something. I suspect if little boys were back then like they are now, they probably stayed unclean. Whosoever touches any creeping thing. That just, creeping things just appeal to little boys somehow. Whosoever touches any creeping thing, whereby he may be made unclean, or a man of whom he may take uncleanness, whatsoever uncleanness he has, the soul which touches any such shall be unclean until even, until erev, and shall not eat of the holy things unless he washes flesh with water. And when the sun is down, he shall be clean. All right, when is erev? Until erev. When is erev? When the sun is down. Sunset. Now, let's just notice there are a number of places that define it. I'll just show you 2, just sort of for the sake of time, but they, I think, will establish the point. Let's go back to Joshua chapter 8. In Joshua chapter 8, in verse 28, we read that Joshua burned Ai, the city of Ai, and he made it a heap forever, even a desolation unto this day. And the king of Ai he hanged on a tree until eventide, or until erev. That's what the term is in the Hebrew, same word. The king of Ai, he hanged on a tree until erev, until evening. And as soon as the sun was down, Joshua commanded that they should take his carcass down from the tree. Okay, when is erev? When is evening? When the sun goes down, sunset. Let me show you. I'll just show you one other place. You see, erev, or sunset, marks the end of one day as well as the beginning of another day. Notice in Leviticus 23 and verse 27. On the 10th day of the 7th month there shall be a day of atonement. And it goes through and describes that. Notice in verse 32. It shall be unto you a Sabbath of rest. You shall afflict your souls. In the 9th day of the month at even, at Erev, from even unto even, from Erev to Erev, shall you celebrate your Sabbath. Well, Erev is sunset. Now, the 10th day of the 7th month is atonement. And you are to afflict your souls beginning when? At sunset on the 9th day. When the 9th day ends at sunset, it becomes the 10th day. See, sunset is a moment of time that marks both the end of one day. Sunset can be at the end of the day. It's also at the beginning of the day. Depends on the context here very clearly. It is sunset that ends the 9th day of the 7th month. We're to begin fasting, and we fast from sunset to sunset. Sunset at the end of the 9th to sunset at the end of the 10th. That makes the whole 10th day a Sabbath. Sunset to sunset. So one day ends and another day begins when the sun sets at Erev. But back in Exodus 12, they weren't told to kill the Passover at sunset. They were told to keep it up until the 14th day of the same month. This is verse 6. And the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it between the two evenings. Shall kill it ben ha-erevi. Now, that phrase is used, as I mentioned, just a few times. We've seen clearly what sunset is, what evening, Erev, is. Let's notice the places where this expression is used. This is the first place that it's used. In Exodus 12, we're told that the Passover was to be eaten during this time called between the evenings. The Jewish translation renders that dusk or twilight. Let's go back in Exodus to chapter 16. Now, I want to show you a couple of interesting things in Exodus chapter 16. Did you know that we can know the exact days of the week on which the events in which the holy days came in the year of the Exodus? Did you know that? Did you know that? I think it's sort of interesting. We know and can prove that the events of Christ's final Passover, that in the year of Christ's final Passover, the Passover occurred on a Wednesday, and the first holy day of unleavened bread was on a Thursday. We understand that. I'll go through some of that tomorrow. But did you know that the Passover happened to fall that exact same way the very first year, the year of the Exodus? I'll show you that. The answer, the key to that is in Exodus 16. You just have to do a little math, a little counting, not anything complicated. Exodus 16:1. They took their journey from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came unto the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after their departing out of the land of Egypt. Now, this is exactly 1 month after the Exodus. Remember, the Exodus occurred on the 15th day of the first month. Here, they came to this wilderness at the time of the 15th day of the 2nd month. They evidently got there in the afternoon, and they were encamped on this 15th day of the 2nd month. Notice what we're told. The whole congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The children of Israel said unto them, Would to God we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, when we did eat bread to the full. You brought us forth into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. The Lord said unto Moses, I'll rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them whether they'll walk in my law or not. Now, here we are at point 1 month after the beginning of the Exodus. The children of Israel had brought provisions with them, but evidently they brought about a month's worth of provisions, and their provisions had run out. Now here they are encamped exactly 1 month after the Exodus, and they are complaining. Oh, woe is us, we're going to die. We're run out of the provisions we brought, and we don't have anything, and we don't have anything around. God told Moses, He said, now I'm going to show you something. I'm going to rain bread from heaven, verse 4.
And it'll come to pass on the 6th day they shall prepare that which they bring in. It'll be twice as much as they gather daily. Moses and Aaron said unto all the children of Israel, at even, at Erev, at sunset, then you shall know that the Lord has brought you out from the land of Egypt. So here they are complaining. Early on in the day they're complaining. They've run out of provisions. They're out of food. They're out here. They're going to die. Woe is us. Moses and Aaron said, at sunset today, you're going to find out that God is the one who brought you out. And verse 7, in the morning, tomorrow morning, then you shall see the glory of the Lord. He's heard your murmurings against the Lord. And what are we that you murmur against us? What are you complaining about us for? We're just God's instruments. It's God that is really the one involved. Moses said, this shall be, when the Lord shall give you in the evening flesh to eat, and in the morning bread to the full. For that the Lord hears your murmurings when you murmur against Him. And what are we? Your murmurings are not against us, but against the Lord. Moses spoke unto Aaron, saying to all the congregation of the children of Israel, come near before the Lord. He's heard your murmurings. Came to pass, as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the children of Israel, they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. Here it was, they looked out there, and they could just see this glowing cloud moving toward them. And the Lord spoke unto Moses and said, I have heard the murmurings of the children of Israel. Speak unto them, saying, at even you shall eat flesh. But now what you don't realize, just in the normal English translations, is the word here in verse 12, at even, is not Erev. It is that other phrase, Ben ha-Erevim. At twilight, between the two evenings, you shall eat flesh. And in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. And it shall come to pass that at even, at Erev, at sunset, the quails came up and covered the camp. Oh, okay. Quail arrived when the sun set. This was the Sabbath. And I'll show you that just as we go on just a little bit further. It was the Sabbath. When the sun set, at the end of that 15th day of the second month, the quail showed up. When did they eat the quail? They ate the quail during the period of dusk at twilight. The quail showed up, and evidently they had been sort of blown in by a wind from the Red Sea, and they were tuckered out, and they stopped, and they could just go out and catch it. So they caught these quail and dressed them out and cooked them and ate them. This occurred when? After sunset, during the period of dusk, during the period of twilight. Remember, they were hungry. They'd been complaining about food. As soon as the quail lit, they went out there and got them. It was sunset. It was after the Sabbath. The Sabbath ended when the sun set. And so, between the two evenings, you shall eat flesh, verse 12. In the morning, get up tomorrow morning, you'll be filled with bread, and you'll know I'm the Lord. So, sure enough, at sunset the quails came, covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay round about the host. And when the dew that lay was gone up, behold, upon the face of the wilderness there lay a small round thing, as small as the hoarfrost on the ground. And when the children of Israel saw it, they said one to another, it's manna. For they knew not what it was. Now, actually, what they said was, what's that? What's it? You see, the Hebrew word for what's that is manna. So you know some Hebrew. So you know, if you just point at something you don't know what it is and say, manna. That just means, what's it? So they gave it a very scientific name. They went out there and they said, what's that? So that's what they called it from the next 40 years, is what's it? So the children of Israel, they saw all this stuff out there. They didn't know what it was. And Moses said, they said, what's that? And Moses said, this is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Gather of it every man according to his eating, an omer for every man according to the number of your persons. An omer is about 2 quarts. Take you every man for them which are in his tents. And the children of Israel did so and gathered, some more, some less. And when they meted it out, with an omer. He that had gathered much had nothing over. He that gathered little had no lack. They gathered every man according to his eating. Moses said, now don't leave any of it until the morning. You ever notice sometimes when you tell somebody, now whatever you do, don't do so and so? Well, verse 20, notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto Moses. Some of them left of it until the morning. Well, I don't know. It came this morning, but how do I know it's going to show up tomorrow morning? I'm going to save me a little bit back. Well, when they got up in the morning, they didn't have a very appetizing sight. It had bred worms and stank. Now, that would sort of make you lose your appetite. You'd save this back for breakfast, and you look and hear little maggots crawling all around, and things stunk like who knows what. And Moses was wroth with them. Moses probably smelled the stuff just walking by the tents, and he knew. Boy, he was mad. So they gathered it every morning. Have you ever noticed human nature hadn't changed a lot over the years? Can you imagine that maybe people would do something similar today? Well, they gathered every morning, every man according to his eating, and when the sun waxed hot, it melted. And it came to pass that on the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for one man. All the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses, and he said, well, this is that which the Lord has said. Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which you will bake today, seethe that which you will seethe. That which remains over lay up for you to be kept until the morning. And they laid it up until the morning as Moses bade, and it did not stink, neither was there any worm therein. Now, think about it. This is... Moses told them, verse 25, eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it. On the 7th day, which is the Sabbath, there will be none. Guess what? It came to pass, verse 27, there went out some of the people on the 7th day to gather, but they didn't find any. So there are always a few hard heads. You say, well, I don't know, I sort of like mine fresh. I'm going to go out there and just check. But it wasn't there. But now, when did God start giving it? You remember on the 15th day of the 2nd month, exactly a month after the Exodus, they were belly aching and complaining, we finally run out of food and you're going to starve us to death. Moses said, now, God's going to show you something. At sunset tonight, the quail are going to show up. And at twilight, at dusk, you're going to have a quail supper. Because they're going to show up at sunset. You can go out and grab them and be cranked up. And tomorrow morning, there's going to be bread. And they gathered that bread for 6 days. That means Sunday morning, Monday morning, Tuesday morning, Wednesday morning, Thursday morning, Friday morning. 6 days. And then this introduced them to the Sabbath. So clearly the 15th day of the 2nd month was a Sabbath. And if you want to lay it out just in a chart form, you'll find the first month always has 30 days. If you lay it out in chart form, you'll find that if the 15th of the day of the 2nd month is a Sabbath, then when you start counting back, you'll find that Passover would have come on a Wednesday and the first holy day on Thursday, just as it did in the final year of Christ's ministry. That's sort of incidental, doesn't prove anything a whole lot, but it's sort of interesting. Sometimes God gives us a framework to lay things out. But you see, they began gathering manna at that point. But what do we find as he goes on? God is now introducing them to the Sabbath, and he is reinforcing that by giving them a double portion of manna on Friday morning, and it will last through until a new batch comes on Sunday morning. Week after week, this is the thing that was to be done. And verse 35, the children of Israel did eat whatsit for 40 years. So that's the way God took care of it. But what do we find? This phrase, between the 2 evenings. The Passover was to be killed between the 2 evenings. They ate the quail between the 2 evenings. The quail arrived at sunset, and they ate them in the immediate period. You know, between the time of sunset and total darkness, you've got an hour and
10, 15, 20 minutes, depending on the, let's say, the time of year, depending on the latitude. In this area, in the spring and in that latitude, you're basically looking about at a little over an hour. That would be the period of dusk, the period between sunset and darkness. Now let me show you quickly, if we can, there is such a thing as moving quickly. Let me show you the other places where this phrase is used. The next place is in Exodus 29. In Exodus 29, Moses was in the mountain. He was receiving instructions from God in terms of the tabernacle and the altar and all of these things. And he was told in Exodus 29, verse 38, "This is that which you shall offer upon the altar. 2 lambs of the first year, day by day continually." This was the daily offering. 1 lamb you shall offer in the morning, verse 39, "and the other lamb you shall offer," it says at even, but the phrase is ben ha-erevim, between the 2 evenings. You shall offer at dusk. And it instructs the meal offering and the oil and the wine that was to be offered with the 1 lamb. And verse 41, "The other lamb you shall offer at even." You shall offer between the 2 evenings, ben ha-erevim. "And do therefore according to the meal offering of the morning." Verse 42, "This shall be a continual burnt offering throughout your generations." So every morning and every evening here being defined as the time of twilight. The time after the sun set, but while it's still light, while you can still see. And this was the morning and the evening sacrifice. Now as you come on down, chapter 30, the next chapter, that this phrase is used, "You shall make an altar to burn incense on." And it gave instructions for the altar. And verse 7, "Aaron shall burn thereon sweet incense every morning when he dresses the lamps. He shall burn incense upon it. And when Aaron lights the lamps at even," and this is that phrase again, ben ha-erevim, "when Aaron lights the lamps between the 2 evenings, he shall burn incense upon it," perpetual incense. When do you light the lamps? Well, you light them during that period of twilight or dusk. You light them after sunset, before it gets black dark. When do you dress the lamps? Well, in the morning, dawn, once by about the time of sunup, it's gotten light enough that you can see without the lamps. And so the lamps are turned out. Any of you, ever used old coal oil lamps or things like that? You've got to dress the lamp. You've got to trim the wick so that you cut off the burn part. You've got fresh wick to light the next night. That's what Aaron did in the morning. When it got daylight, they turned the lamps off in the tabernacle and they trimmed the wick. At twilight, after the sunset, but before it got totally dark, they lit the lamps. They went in there. It was beginning to get dark. You needed a lamp to see, but it was still enough light that you could see how to light it. Now, the only other place, I won't turn there, but you can, is Numbers 9, which is where it gives instructions for the second Passover. And it says that the second Passover was to be killed exactly the way the first Passover was, only exactly a month later, the 14th day of the second month, between the 2 evenings. So clearly, the only 5 places this expression is used in the entirety of the Bible, it clearly refers to the time of twilight, of dusk. It would have to refer to the time at the beginning of a day, because the old day ends when the sun sets, the new day begins. The period of dusk, sunset can mark the end of a day and the beginning of a day. But there's only one period of twilight in every day. Once the sun is set, the old day is ended, the new day is begun. That period of twilight is the beginning part of the new day. Now, with that in mind, let's go back to Exodus 12, and let's trace through the account. They were to keep the lamb up until the 14th day,
of the same month, they were to kill it at twilight. They were to kill it at this period between the evenings, at dusk. And they shall take of the blood and strike it on the two side posts, the upper door post. They are to eat the flesh in that night, roast with fire, and unleavened bread. With bitter herbs they shall eat it. Eat not of it raw, nor sodden at all with water, but roast with fire. Now, let me show you something. We're going to come back to this in a minute. But there is a specific instruction here. They were to eat of it roast with fire. It was to be dry roasted. They were not to eat of it, as it says in verse 9, sodden. Now, you look that phrase up. There's a couple of Hebrew phrases here. One refers to the roasting. This term that is translated sodden, which is basically boshel or boshel, can refer to something it refers to something cooked in a liquid. It can refer to something that's fried. It can refer to something that is boiled. It can refer to something that is cooked with water and juice. It's used in sacrifices to refer to even to some of the things that were fried, some of the birds. You didn't know they had fried chicken back then. Who knows? Maybe one of Colonel Sanders' ancestors was one of those priests that was there. It mentions cooking it in oil or frying it. It even describes the frying pans they had. We won't turn back and go through that. God gave them dimensions on all of those things. So Southern fried chicken isn't such a bad thing after all, is it? But that's one of the phrases. But on this particular, for the Passover, they were not to cook it that way. They couldn't fry it. They couldn't boil it in a pot. They couldn't cook it that way. But they had to roast it to dry roast it, to roast it with fire. Now we're going to keep that in mind because we're going to see significance on that a little later. They were to eat it with their loins girded, their shoes on their feet, their staff in their hand. Eat it in haste. It's the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, man and beast. Against all the gods of Egypt I'll execute judgment. The blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. The plague shall not be upon you to destroy you. This day, verse 14, shall be to you for a memorial. You're to keep it a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. That is referring to the Passover. It is a memorial of what? A memorial of when God passed over the houses that were under the blood of the Lamb. Now notice in verse 15, 7 days shall you eat unleavened bread. Even the first day you shall put away, or shall have put away is the better rendering. You shall have put away leavening out of your houses. Whosoever eats leavened bread from the first day unto the 7th day, that soul shall be cut off. In the first day there's to be a holy convocation, and the 7th day a holy convocation. No manner of work shall be done in them, except that which every man must eat. That only may be done of you. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for in this selfsame day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall you observe this day in your generations by an ordinance forever. Now we come to the days of unleavened bread. The days of unleavened bread are celebrated for a different reason than the Passover. The Passover is a memorial of the Israelites being passed over and spared from death. But why are you to observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread? Verse 17, for in this same day I brought your armies, your multitudes, out of the land of Egypt. The Feast of Unleavened Bread celebrates deliverance. It celebrates deliverance from captivity. It celebrates freedom. I've brought you out. Verse 18, in the first month, on the 14th day of the month at even, at Erev, at sunset, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at even, at sunset. Now, when evening or sunset is used here in this way, when evening is used, when sunset or Erev is used, it normally refers it's normally connected with the very end of the day. Remember we read back in Leviticus 23 that on the 9th day of the month, at evening, at Erev, at sunset, you shall afflict your souls from even to even, from Erev to Erev. Here, when the sun sets on the 14th day of the month, you're to begin eating unleavened bread, and you're to do so until the sun sets on the 21st day of the month. Now, we know there's 7 days of unleavened bread. Leviticus chapter 23, let's just very briefly turn there to clarify the point. Leviticus 23 and verse 5. In the 14th day of the first month, at evening, is the Lord's Passover. On the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread unto the Lord. So, the 15th day is the feast of unleavened bread. 7 days shall you eat unleavened bread. All right. The 15th is the first day. 16th is the second. The 17th is the third. The 18th is the fourth. The 19th is the fifth. The 20th is the sixth. And the 21st day of the first month would be the seventh day. So when it says back in Exodus 12, that in verse 18, in the first month on the 14th day at sunset, that's talking of the sunset that ends the 14th, until the 21st day at sunset, the sunset that ends the 21st. That's 7 days. The 21st day, if the 15th day of the first month is the first holy day, which it is, the 21st day of the same month is always the last holy day. So here we're going from sunset to sunset. Sunset, 7 days. Now, verse 19, 7 days shall there be no leavening found in your houses. Whosoever eats that which is leavened, that soul shall be cut off. Verse 20, you shall eat nothing leavened in all your habitations. You shall eat unleavened bread. So they went through, they were given instructions, they took the hyssop, they dipped it in the blood of the lambs that were slaughtered there between the two evenings there at dusk, and they began to put them on the doorposts. The Lord will pass through and smite the Egyptians, verse 23. And so, as you come on down, verse 28, the children of Israel went away, did as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. So did they. It came to pass that at midnight the Eternal smote all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat on the throne, unto the firstborn of the captive in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians. There was a great cry in Egypt. There was not a house where there wasn't one dead. And he called for Moses and Aaron by night, and he said, rise up, get you forth from among my people, you and the children of Israel, and go and serve the Lord as you've said. And take your flocks and your herds as you've said, and be gone, and bless me also. The Egyptians were urgent upon the people that they might send them out of the land in haste. They said, we're going to die. The people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading troughs being bound up in their clothes upon their shoulders, had that all packed up in their backpack. And the children of Israel did according to the word of Moses. They borrowed of the Egyptians jewels of silver and jewels of gold and raiment. The Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so they lent unto them such things as they required, and they spoiled the Egyptians. This is not, by the way, the first example of permissive child rearing. When the Israelites spoiled the Egyptians, this is a different kind of spoiling going on. Now, understand what happened. Midnight, the firstborn died. Children of Israel had celebrated earlier in the evening. They had slaughtered the lamb and roasted it there during the period of twilight. They had eaten their meal. At midnight, the death angel came within a relatively short period of time. Some homes maybe right away, others maybe 30 minutes or an hour later. Somebody realized what had happened, and this wail began to go up. And people were, next door neighbors were waking up to see what was going on, and within a relatively short period of time, all over. Some point, probably, let's say, shortly after midnight, Pharaoh became aware that his firstborn son was dead. Now, Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron. How did he call for them? He pick up his cell phone? No. He had to call a soldier
and have him mount up a horse. And if you want to check on a map, you'll find that from where Pharaoh's palace was to the land of Goshen to the area of Ramses where Moses and the Israelites were was 25 miles. So, Moses, here the soldier gets on his horse and he takes off and goes to get Moses. Moses has got to get loaded up on something. Maybe he gets on a horse and he and Aaron come back to the palace because Pharaoh talks to him. Time is passing. Pharaoh doesn't maybe take very long. Pharaoh says, look, you get those folks, you get out of here, take everything you want, but just get out and go. Bless me in the process. So, Moses and Aaron come back. Now, we're told here that Israel, verse 37, the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 on foot that were men besides the children. So we're looking at 600,000 families. It takes time. 600,000 families are spread out over a few miles now. They've got means of summoning, trumpet blasts or things like that. But they went, verse 38, the flocks and the herds, even very much cattle. I'm sure they had them all penned up. They were ready to get going. But it took time to assemble. We'll have a relatively small group, let's say around 60 or so, to go through the serving line this evening. It will take some time. If you've ever been, some of you here in Big Sandy, I remember back when maybe there were a feast or various things when there were lines, when there were thousands of people to go through a line. It takes some time. Now, you multiply out the table. They had 600,000 to try to get together. You don't do that in 10 minutes. You don't do it in an hour. And after all, there's cows and goats and sheep and all of these things to be herded along. It took time. The Egyptians were urgent on. By the time Moses and Aaron got back and signaled the people, and after all they had told them that they were to stay in their houses all night, they were told that on this particular occasion the children of Israel did what Moses and Aaron commanded. So about daylight the next day they were beginning to send out the signals, and people were beginning to gather up. The Egyptians were out, and they were urgent upon the people, and they were giving them things, and just hold your place there. And let's turn back to Numbers 33. Numbers 33, verse 1. These are the journeys of the children of Israel which went forth out of the land of Egypt with their armies under the hand of Moses and Aaron. And Moses wrote their goings out according to their journeys by the commandment of the Lord. These are their journeys. Verse 3, they departed from Ramses in the first month on the 15th day of the first month on the morrow after the Passover. The children of Israel went out with a high hand in the sight of all the Egyptians, for the Egyptians buried all their firstborn, which the Lord had smitten among them. Upon their gods also the Lord executed judgment. The children of Israel removed from Ramses and pitched in Succoth. Now, for those who want to assume that the Passover comes at the end of the 14th, what they're really saying is that they think it occurred on the 15th, because, but anyway, they for those who would claim that, they would have to have all the firstborn die, the equivalent of midnight tonight. The children of Israel all line up and be on their way, because Deuteronomy 16:1 tells us one additional fact. Observe the month of Abib, keep the Passover unto the Lord your God, for in the month of Abib the Lord your God brought you forth out of Egypt by night. Are we saying that the Egyptians buried their dead at 2 o'clock in the morning? That they were spoiling the Egyptians? Of course not. The daylight portion of the 14th, the period of time we're in right now, they celebrated the Passover last night, just at the time we did, when they killed the lamb, at the time
right after sunset, during the period of dusk. They killed and prepared and roasted the lamb. At midnight, the death angel came through. All this commotion was stirring up during the wee hours of the morning. Pharaoh sent for Moses. Moses made the trip, and Moses came back. By this time, see, that's 75 miles traveled back and forth. By the time the soldier comes, gets him, he goes back, then he goes back. So you've got to factor in the amount of time for horses to travel that amount of time. Then they began to blow the horns. People began to assemble. It's daylight by now. Through the daylight portion, they're gathering up. It takes, you're talking of 600,000 families are having to congregate and organize in a small space. You're talking of hours. They're spoiling the Egyptians. The Egyptians are out throughout the daylight period. They're burying their dead. And they're watching all of this commotion, and they're watching all these Israelites line up. You see, they baked, Exodus 12:39, they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they brought forth out of Egypt. It was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not tear it. The Egyptians were urging them on, hurry up, go on, leave. So right here before they left, they baked some unleavened cakes. Doesn't take very long. Just sort of pat out the dough and put it on something hot, and they baked them some unleavened cakes, and they came out of Egypt by night. In other words, this evening, the equivalent of this evening after sunset, they started their journey, and they traveled the several miles from Ramses to Succoth, and spent the night hours on up till maybe after midnight coming to Succoth, and they camped there. Succoth was their camping spot. The word Succoth refers to tents. So that was the first place they camped. They were leaving where they lived. They came out of Egypt by night. They came out with a high hand. Now we're told in Exodus 12:40, the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt completed 430 years. If you've got a King James translation, you notice the word was, and I think most of the other English translations do that, but the King James puts the was in italics, and the reason for that is there is no verb in the sentence in Hebrew. The sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt, 430 years. It completed a 430-year period. You have to put two or three scriptures together. Paul makes it very clear back in the book of Galatians when he explains that the law at Sinai was given exactly 430 years after God had made the covenant with Abraham. God had made the covenant with Abraham. It's recorded in Genesis 17:1. That was the period of 430 years. The law given at Sinai was given just about 7 weeks after this event. It was in the same year. The sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt completed this 430-year period. That's the proper verb to supply. It came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the self-same day it came to pass, that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. God had made a promise to Abraham 430 years to the day earlier. Did you know that the covenant, we know when the covenant with Abraham was made? It was made on the 15th day of the first month. We know that because we're told the Exodus occurred 430 years to the day later. God made Abraham a promise, but it was 430 years before God even began to fulfill the promise. 430 years to the day. God now began to deliver Abraham's descendants. And they were ready to start their journey to the land that God had promised Abraham. So, God doesn't always get in as big a hurry for things as we do, does He? You ever notice that? So at the conclusion of this 430-year period, right to the day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night to be much observed unto the Eternal for bringing them out from the land of Egypt. This is that night of the Lord to be observed of all the children of Israel in their generations. Why do we observe this particular night? We observe it to the Lord for bringing Israel was told to observe it to the Lord for bringing them out from the land of Egypt. It is distinct from the Passover. The Passover was their being passed over. Their being saved from death, exempted from death. But 24 hours later, they came out of Egypt by night, the day after, the morrow after the Passover. That's when they were doing all of these things and getting ready, and they began their journey. They quickly made some unleavened bread to grab a bite to eat. All their stuff was bound up on their back. So they made the bread of haste, quick bread. Make it in a few minutes. Pat out the dough, put it on a hot flat rock, and in a few minutes' time it was done. It was cooked. They came out. They came out with a high hand. So it is a celebration of deliverance. It is the beginning of freedom. So we're told about these instructions in this night to be much observed. Now let's look at this word observe. The phrase in the Hebrew shemer, which basically means observe, and it's used a number of times in the Bible. Let me just show you a few right here in Exodus 12. Exodus 12:17 says, "You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread." On down verse 24. "You shall observe this thing for an ordinance to you and to your sons forever." Verse 25. "It shall come to pass when you come to the land which the Lord your God shall give you, according as He has promised, that you shall keep this service." Observe, keep, it's the same thing. David used the same word back in Psalm 141, verse 3, when he said, "O Lord, set a watch at the door of my mouth." That's a good prayer to pray sometimes. David realized that, I need you to set a guard there, and something starts coming out that shouldn't, spirit, just stab it. You better chop it down, because I'm afraid of something getting out. We all ought to be afraid of something getting out. David was conscious of that. He didn't want, because once you've said words, you can't unsay them. You can turn around and tell somebody, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that." But if you said something hurtful to them, you can't unsay that. You can say, "I'm sorry," and hopefully they say, "Yeah, that's fine, not a problem." But nevertheless, there's been a certain hurt. So David said, "Lord, set a watch. Guard the door of my mouth." Well, this phrase, to watch, to observe, to keep, that's the term that's used here in verse 42. It's a night to be much observed. Only, it's used in a different form here in verse 42. It's used in the plural form. It's used twice in verse 42. It's used in the plural form, only times in the entire Old Testament that it's used that way. Now, the plural form was a superlative in Hebrew. For instance, Holy of Holies, Song of Songs. It was a superlative phrase. This was a night, and actually the word much is no, there's not a separate word for much in the Hebrew. It's just simply the plural form of sort of like observings. It is a night, and it's an idiomatic way of saying a night to be much observed, a night of observings, not just to be observed, but to be much observed. It's a night to be much observed unto the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is the night of the Lord to be observed, to be much observed, to be taken great note of. It is a celebration. You see, when we observe this evening, what we are observing is a celebration of the beginning of a journey toward freedom. Dr. Torrance isn't here with us today. He's up in Oklahoma now. He was with the brethren in Russellville, Arkansas last night for the Passover, and then was going on over to Oklahoma City to be with them for the night to be observed and for the Holy Day tomorrow.
But, you can ask him. He can relate to that in a very personal way, because I think, as most of you know, he was, as he puts it, a guest of the emperor for most of World War II, and not in very nice accommodations. He was a prisoner of war. And at the end of the war, he and those with him in the POW camp in Japan were just almost at the point of death. I think he's told me that he was somewhere around 90 or 95 pounds, just almost starved to death. Can you imagine how people in a situation like that, the excitement they felt when they looked up and they saw the familiar American uniforms marching to the door and opening up? They were liberated. They were free. When we understand what is being celebrated, because what Israel of old went through is a picture for us. Now I want to show you one other aspect of this. I think I have time. And that is back in Deuteronomy 16. Let me explain something. You know, sometimes phrases, there is a technically precise phrase. The Passover refers to the celebration that begins the 14th day of the first month. The Feast of Unleavened Bread refers to the 7 days beginning on the 15th, ending on the 21st. But you know, terminology sometimes becomes sort of broad in general. You and I, as we come toward the fall, we talk about, where are you going to the feast? Now, when you talk about, well, I'm going to the feast, or we're going off to the Feast of Tabernacles, does that mean you're not planning on observing the last great day? Oh, well, no, but you just, you don't generally say, well, I'm going to the Feast of Tabernacles and the last great day. You generally say, I'm going to the feast. Let me show you an example back in Luke chapter 2. Verse 41, this is talking about Jesus when he was growing up. Luke 2:41, now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast, and when they had fulfilled the days. Now it says his parents went up to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. Did that mean they just went up for one day and turned around as soon as the Passover service was over, they hooked it back? Well, no, they went up and they stayed for the whole time. When the days, as it said, when they had fulfilled the days as they returned, they stayed for the whole thing. But by New Testament times, the entire period was simply referred to as the Passover. And that was a general term. Now that type of expression had begun to be used much earlier. Ezekiel, in Ezekiel chapter 45, Ezekiel 45:21. It talks about in the first month, in the 14th day of the month, you shall have the Passover, a feast of 7 days. Unleavened bread shall be eaten. See, the whole festival period was called the Passover. That had begun to be the case several hundred years after these things after Moses wrote. Now we know that in the Torah, there were things, particularly in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, there were edits that were made under God's inspiration. And what I mean by edits were things to clarify the text. The easiest one to see right off is Deuteronomy 34:10. In Deuteronomy 18, Moses had made a prophecy and recorded a prophecy that ultimately God would raise up a prophet like unto him. Deuteronomy 34:10, and there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Deuteronomy 34 describes Moses' death. Now, Joshua may have recorded the events of Moses' death, but when the statement is made at the concluding of the book of Moses, there has not arisen a prophet like unto Moses. think Joshua wrote that. Well, Moses has been dead 10 minutes, and the prophet like unto Moses hasn't arisen yet. Well, no. That is a phrase that is added in at the end of the Old Testament period, looking back, pointing out that this prophecy made earlier in the book of Deuteronomy had not been fulfilled. And then obviously, therefore, pointing forward to the New Testament. Sometimes there were edits that were made to update place names, because names of places change over the years. And old names become unfamiliar. I can show you an example of that in Genesis 14, where it talks about Abraham arming his servants to go out and recover Lot. In Genesis 14:14, when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants born in his own house, 318, and he pursued them unto Dan. Well, Dan was Abraham's great-grandson. Dan wasn't even a gleam in Abraham's eye by this point. If you read in the book of Judges, you'll find that it was hundreds of years after that event before the tribe of Dan captured the city of Laish and changed the name of it to Dan. But by the time the Old Testament was put in final form by Ezra, hundreds and hundreds of years, many hundreds of years had passed since that event occurred. People had forgotten what the old name of the place was. Everybody knew it as Dan. When Ezra edited the account, he put in the familiar place name. There are places in Texas. You do checking in Texas history, and you find sometimes, a place had its name changed. Maybe it's changed 100, 120, 130 years ago. Everybody's forgotten what the old name was. They remember what it's known as now. So there were terms that were introduced into the writings of Moses at the time of Ezra to help to clarify things for the people who were reading it, the things with which they were familiar. Now, I say all of that as background to help understand Deuteronomy 16. Because you have to read Deuteronomy 16 very carefully to understand that it is actually describing the days of unleavened bread and what we call the night to be much observed. Deuteronomy 16:1. Observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover, referring here in the general sense as it later came to be used, the Passover, the whole Passover season unto the Lord your God. For in the month of Abib, the Lord your God brought you forth out of Egypt by night. The emphasis is on the deliverance. Therefore, you shall therefore sacrifice the Passover, or as the Jewish translation renders it, the Passover offerings. There were the offerings made through the whole period of the days of unleavened bread were called Passover offerings. It's not specifically referring to the Passover lamb at the beginning of the 14th. Now I can show you that. You shall therefore sacrifice the Passover offerings unto the Lord your God of the flock and the herd in the place which the Lord shall choose to place His name there. Now, several things, or two things. One, this is a sacrifice which can come from either the flock or the herd. The word herd here, the Hebrew term, can only refer to cattle. The Passover, the sacrifice that was made at the beginning of the 14th, at the period of dusk at the beginning of the 14th, could only be a lamb or a kid of the goats. It could only be a first-year lamb or kid. This is a sacrifice that can be from either the flock or the herd. It can come from the cattle. They didn't sacrifice cattle on the period of dusk at the Passover. This is also one that can only be, this is a sacrifice that can only be made in the place where God has placed His name. Now, if you go back and read the instructions for the Passover made at the beginning of the 14th, that was done by each family. But other scriptures show that all of the sacrifices made during the days of unleavened bread had to be made in the place where God placed His name. You shall eat no leavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread therewith, even the bread of affliction, for you came forth out of the land of Egypt in haste, that you may remember the day when you came forth out of the land of Egypt all the days of your life.
The focus of this celebration is remembering when you left Egypt. There shall be no leavened bread seen with you in all your coasts 7 days. It's talking about the Feast of Unleavened Bread, called in later times Passover, being used as a generic time to refer to the whole period. Neither shall there be anything of the flesh which you sacrifice the first day at sunset remain all night until the morning. Now, that does not just the Passover lamb that was sacrificed at dusk at the beginning of the 14th could not remain until morning, and any of it that did had to be burned. But if you go to Leviticus 7, you'll find that the peace offerings and the thank offerings, they weren't allowed to remain all night until morning either. You couldn't just keep it and continue to use it. So that was a phrase that did not just apply to the Passover lamb. The others didn't have to be burned, but you couldn't use them after daylight. You couldn't keep them past the morning. So this was a sacrifice. You may not sacrifice the Passover offerings. This is interesting, the way the Jewish translation renders it, referring to that they understand, what's being talked about within any of your gates. But at the place the Lord shall choose, it's to be sacrificed at evening, at Erev, at sunset, at the going down of the sun. Not between the two evenings, as was done at the beginning of the 14th. At the season you came forth out of Egypt. You shall roast it and eat it in the place which the Lord your God shall choose. Now here's another key, and it's not apparent in most English translations that I checked, but I checked the Hebrew, and the term that's translated here in verse 7, that's translated roast in the King James, I don't know how you have it translated in your Bible, that is that phrase, boshel, that was used back in Exodus 12, verse 9, that's translated sodden. You shall not eat of it sodden. You don't eat of it fried or boiled. It has to be dry roasted. Well, the word for dry roasted is tseli, which is totally different. The word that's used here in verse 7, in describing how you're to cook it, is the very word that you were told not to do to the Passover lamb. The word that's used here in verse 7 is the term that means to cook with a liquid. To either fry it or boil it or cook it up in some way where you're cooking it with a liquid. So it's clearly, we see that it is different, it's distinct. It can be cattle as well as sheep. It is to be cooked with liquid rather than to be dry roasted over a fire. And it is connected with deliverance from Egypt. It's to be consumed only in the place that God has chosen, as opposed to where they slaughtered the Passover lamb at the beginning of the 14th, and they're there at their homes. And verse 8, 6 days shall you eat unleavened bread. On the seventh day you have a solemn assembly. The whole description here in the opening part of chapter 16 is a celebration of the time when you came forth out of the land of Egypt, verse 3, that you may remember the day when you came forth out of the land of Egypt all the days of your life. It is describing the days of unleavened bread. It is describing the period that begins with the night to be much observed. Why do we observe it? Because it is a time that celebrates. It's a time of celebration. Now, we normally we celebrate it with a festive meal and things pertaining to that. And it's something we try to do it nice and special. A lot of work and effort has gone in. I know many of you ladies have put in a lot of time and effort, not only in the preparation of food, but the beautiful flowers that were arranged yesterday prior to the Sabbath, and all of the things that have gone in. Because it's a special time. It's a festive time. It is a time when Israel came out with a high hand. A time of celebration, because the time of being liberated.
is a wonderful time. Let's come back to Romans rather. Romans chapter 6. The Passover represents God extending His grace, His unmerited pardon, His mercy, His freely bestowed gifts upon you and me. God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. God's grace is commended toward us, but you and I are commanded in Scripture, do not receive the grace of God in vain. Don't just take it and treat it lightly or cheaply. You and I are to respond to God's grace. Paul asks the question in Romans 6 verse 1, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? God did not save the lives of the Israelites in Egypt so that they could remain there as slaves to Pharaoh. He saved their lives so that now they would be able to follow Him out of Egypt and to the Promised Land. And when they came out, their deliverance that night after the Passover, as they came out by night, they came out with a high hand. They were happy. They were excited. They were liberated. Finally, 430 years to the day after God had made a promise to Abraham, He began to actually fulfill it by rescuing Abraham's descendants. And they were happy and they were excited as they came forth. Now, unfortunately, Israel of old left Egypt with their feet. But as Stephen puts it in Acts chapter 7, in their hearts they turned back to Egypt. You and I are called upon not merely to celebrate leaving Egypt with our feet, we're to leave Egypt with our heart and with our mind. Pharaoh is a type of Satan. Egypt is a type of the world. Slavery is a picture of sin because that's what sin is. You and I were enslaved to Satan, his society, and the sins of this world. Shall we continue in sin? We're going to stay in Egypt? That grace may abound? Oh no, God forbid. We're dead to sin. How shall we live any longer therein? Verse 11, reckon yourselves, you also yourselves, to be dead indeed unto sin, alive unto God through Jesus Christ our Lord. Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal bodies, that you should obey it in the lust thereof, neither yield your members as instruments of unrighteousness. We don't stay in Egypt as subjects of Pharaoh. We don't stay as a part of this world. Verse 14, sin shall not have dominion over you. You're not under the law, but under grace. You're no longer under the hold and the penalty of the law, because the sin is the transgression of the law, and the wages of sin is death. Death, of course, is the ultimate captivity, isn't it? The great Houdini was a wonderful escape artist. He could escape from anything. He escaped from everything that ever tried to imprison him, except the grave. He disproves, by the way, all these seances and fortune tellers. A lot of that, quote, spiritualism, that was big popular stuff back at that time. When he was on his deathbed, he told his wife, he said, I've always been able to escape from everything. And he says, if it's possible to escape from death, I'll escape from that too. And he gave her a code. He says, a lot of people probably claim that I've contacted them, but he gave her a code, and he said, this is it. Nobody, if no matter what anybody tells you, unless they tell you this, you'll know it's a fraud. Well, nobody ever told her that. She died. The secret went to her grave with her, but she knew that, Houdini never escaped from the grave. The grave is the ultimate captivity. But you see, Jesus Christ took captivity captive. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But
Verse 17 of Romans 6. God be thanked, you were the servants of sin, but you have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered unto you, being then made free from sin. You became servants of righteousness. Verse 22, now being made free from sin and become servants to God, you have your fruit unto holiness and the end everlasting life. You see, Christ died that we might be passed over, exempted from death. Now, we're preparing to celebrate this evening our journey out of Egypt. Coming out of this world, leaving Egypt behind, leaving the slavery and the servitude of sin behind. We're preparing to celebrate deliverance, a time to be much observed, a time to be taken note of, to be celebrated year by year as we celebrate our deliverance, not merely the physical deliverance of Israel from Egypt, but the spiritual deliverance of the people of God from the bondage of sin, the enslavement of this world and this society. Because you see, brethren, you and I are starting out of sin. We're coming out with a high hand. We're on our way out of Egypt. We're on our way to the promised land.
Additional programs and literature available at hwalibrary.com.